Hello everyone, I am Casey the Gamer, and it's time for another game review. It's time to go on another adventure with Samus Aran. This time, I am covering both Metroid 2 remakes, the fan-made, another Metroid 2 remake, and the official Nintendo remake, Metroid Samus Returns. Another Metroid 2 remake, or AM2R for short, was released on August 6, 2016 for PC. It was developed by a fan known as Dr. M64. Shortly after it was released, Nintendo issued DMCA notices. But as you know, once it is on the internet, it is always on the internet. AM2R was made in the style of Metroid Zero Mission, and it is gorgeous. It features beautiful pixel art, and it plays like an absolute dream. Metroid Samus Returns was released on September 15th, 2017 for the 3DS. It was developed by Mercury Steam and Nintendo EPD, and published by Nintendo. To me, this was huge, as it was the first official 2D Metroid game since Metroid Zero Mission in 2004. And it was also the first good official Metroid game since Metroid Prime 3 in 2007. And I know that Metroid Prime Trilogy was released on the Wii in 2009, but that's just a compilation. And even if we do include that one, there was still a huge gap between the good Metroid titles. Both Metroid Other M in 2010 and Metroid Prime Federation Force in 2016 were not well received at all. So when they announced both Metroid Samus Returns and Metroid Prime 4, which still hasn't come out, but that's besides the point right now, I was hyped because it made me feel like Metroid was finally back after so long. Both AM2R and Samus Returns are amazing games in their own right. Two remakes of the same game. They both do things that I absolutely love. And they're both important games in the Metroid franchise. Who cares if one of them isn't an official title? There is so much love and care put into that game. Anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's get into AM2R and Metroid Samus Returns. There are spoilers ahead for the story of both games. The story of AM2R and Metroid Samus Returns is pretty much the same as the original Metroid 2. The main plot still has Samus heading to the Metroid homeworld, SR388, in order to wipe out the entire species. While on the planet, Samus battles the further evolutions of the Metroid species, the Alpha, Gamma, Zeta, and Omega Metroids. Once she wipes out all of the Metroids on the planet, new larva Metroids pop up, and Samus defeats them as well. After that, Samus has a battle with the Metroid Queen and kills her. With the Metroid Queen defeated, Samus runs into the next room just as another egg hatches. The baby Metroid thinks of Samus as her mother, and the two escape the caverns together to return to the surface. This is where AM2R and Samus Returns differ when remaking the original game, at least in terms of the story. AM2R is basically a one-to-one of the original game here. Samus and the baby Metroid have a nice, peaceful journey back to the surface of the planet, and then they leave in Samus's ship. In Samus Returns, as you approach the surface, there's a bit of a sense of dread the closer you get to your ship. Once you reach your ship, Ridley shows up to try and snatch the baby Metroid. Ridley here is part mechanical, still healing from the Metroid Prime series, which takes place between Metroid 1 and 2. Anyway, Samus has a very intense battle with her nemesis Ridley. The Metroid even joins the battle to help Samus defeat her foe. Once Ridley is defeated, Samus and the Metroid get in her ship and blast off, leaving the planet behind them. Both AM2R and Samus Returns tease the X-Parasites from Metroid Fusion after the credits. Another little tidbit, when you encounter the first Omega Metroid in AM2R, you actually run into some of the soldiers that were sent to the planet by the Galactic Federation. They don't last very long though. And in both games, you find several corpses throughout your adventure. So, that's the story of Metroid 2. I overall prefer the more peaceful journey at the end of both the original Metroid 2 and AM2R, but it can't be denied that the Ridley fight in Samus Returns is amazing. One of the absolute best fights in the entire franchise. Honestly, you can't go wrong with either game. Also, in Samus Returns, as you collect more and more items, you unlock Chozo memories, and you can view those on the main menu. They show things like the Chozo dealing with the X-Parasites and creating the Metroids, and then the final one teases a pretty evil-looking Chozo, perhaps something to explore in another game. So both AM2R and Samus Returns are great 2D Metroid experiences. AM2R plays a lot like Metroid Zero Mission, which is definitely a good thing. But it also does its own thing in some instances. It is closer to a one-to-one remake of the original game than Samus Returns is, but AM2R does also include new things exclusive to it that weren't in the original. Samus Returns is more of a reimagining than a straight-up remake. To me, it feels like a different kind of remake than Metroid Zero Mission was for the original Metroid. But I don't mean that as a bad thing. Samus Returns does plenty of new things that I really love. And it does a couple things that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I don't hate them. The standard running, jumping, and shooting in both games feels pretty good. Again, AM2R is a lot like Metroid Zero Mission and the other 2D games. You run, jump, and shoot your beams and missiles while firing in multiple directions. Samus Returns is like that too, but one of the first new things in that game is the free aim ability. I think it's really cool. You hold down the left bumper and you move the control stick to literally aim in any direction. It can be a little wonky in this one, but overall it works pretty well. In both games, your goal is to explore the planet and wipe out the Metroids while collecting upgrades and power-ups. The power-ups in the games are mostly the same. Both games include power-ups that were not in the original game, but were in later installments. Both games have the Morph Ball, although in Samus Returns you don't start with it, unlike in the original and in AM2R. The others are the Spider Ball, bombs, power bombs, missiles, super missiles, the Varia suit, the gravity suit, the high jump boots, the spring ball, the space jump, the screw attack, the charge beam, the wave beam, the spazer beam, the plasma beam, and the ice beam. While both games have the ice beam, it works differently in each game. In AM2R, the ice beam is the last beam upgrade you get, and it stacks with your other beams. You do not use the enemies as platforms in this game because the ice beam will cause them to crash into the ground and shatter. A detail that I really love. It's so cool to see. It is also used to freeze the larva Metroids later in the game so you can blast them with the missiles or super missiles. The Ice Beam in Samus Returns is found much earlier and does not stack with your other beams. You have to switch to it manually using the icon on the touchscreen. The Ice Beam can be used to freeze enemies, which can then be used as platforms, or they can be shattered as well, but more on that later. In addition to being used to freeze the larva Metroids later on in the game, the Ice Beam in Samus Returns is also able to damage the further evolved Metroids, which is completely different to how the original and AM2R handled it. But I'm not opposed to that, I actually really love that. A power-up in AM2R not present in Samus Returns is the Speed Booster. It works like it does in Fusion and Zero Mission. Just continue running to build up speed and destroy anything in your path. And like usual, you're also able to do the Shine Spark, which leads to some legit fun Shine Spark puzzles. And a power-up available in Samus Returns that isn't in AM2R is the Grapple Beam. I love seeing the Grapple Beam come back, and I love how Mercury Steam handled it for this game. There are Grapple Beam blocks that you can swing across like in Super Metroid. There are also Grapple Beam blocks that you can destroy to open up new pathways and shortcuts. You can also get pulled straight up if you aim at the grapple block above, or you can get pulled across if there is one across from you. The Grapple Beam can also be used on certain enemies in the game. It can be used to yank the Zeta Metroids off the ceiling, and it can also be used on the Metroid Queen to slam her head into the ground. The Grapple Beam can be selected from its touchscreen icon, but if you're aiming at a grapple block without it equipped, it will automatically switch to it for you to use it, which I think is very cool. Also new in Samus Returns are the Aeon abilities. Samus gets 4 in total. There is the Scan Pulse, which expands the map and scans the environment. The Lightning Armor, which prevents physical damage and increases the range of melee counters. Again, more on those later. The Beam Burst, which enhances the currently equipped beam's attack power and enables rapid-fire shots. And finally, the Phase Drift slows down time. Each ability has a different drain on the new Aeon bar in the game. In addition to the abilities, as always, there are expansion tanks. Tanks for your health, your missiles, super missiles, power bombs, and new to Samus Returns are the Aeon expansion tanks. In AM2R, the max for items is 10 energy tanks, 250 missiles, 20 super missiles, and 20 power bombs. In Samus Returns, it's also 10 energy tanks, 264 missiles, 35 super missiles, 20 power bombs, and 15 Aeon tanks. One thing that I love in AM2R is that when you get an expansion tank of anything, it refills that particular thing back to full, whereas normally it was just the energy tanks that did that. Another new thing in Samus Returns has to deal with the Spider Ball and Power Bombs. There are these spikes all over, and you can't really damage boost through them or anything like that. You have to get into the proper position to fit through the gap, switch the Spider Ball on, and lay a power bomb, and it will send you flying through the gap to the other side. It's really cool, and I love it. Alright, let's talk about the melee counter in Samus Returns. You can perform a melee counter on most enemies. There is an indicator when you should hit the counter button, and if you hit it just right, the enemy is stunned and Samus is locked onto them. Shooting them while locked on does way more damage, and it typically kills the enemy after a shot or two, especially as you get the more powerful beams. And enemies that are frozen solid from the Ice Beam can more often than not be shattered with a melee hit. You're also able to perform melee counters on the various Metroids, opening them up for more damage, which shows Samus handling them in a very cinematic and over-the-top fashion. It looks great. You are also able to counter the Queen Metroid and Ridley at certain points as well. I both love and hate the counter. Sometimes it seems like if you don't counter the enemy, it takes way longer to kill them. like your beams or missiles don't do as much damage, and also you can't do the counter while moving. Overall though, it is a welcome addition, and I love the over-the-top ways that Samus lays on the pain to the bosses after a counter move. Some other movement stuff for the games. AM2R allows you to bomb jump and includes spectacular wall jumping. You can jump between the walls or jump off of the same wall. It's so good. A negative point for Samus Returns is that bomb jumping doesn't work, or if it does, I couldn't get the timing right. And the wall jumping is like it was in Metroid Fusion, where you can only jump back and forth between different walls. Both AM2R and Samus Returns have their own unique bosses that weren't in the original game. AM2R features some Chozo defense system as a boss, a brand new Chorizo enemy for you to fight that begins to fly at you during Phase 2. There's a boss called the Tester, which fires missiles and various beams at you, some kind of Chozo tank, a boss called Genesis, which is apparently a reference to a Metroid Fusion enemy, and finally, you have a battle with Samus, another enemy from Metroid Fusion. I love the additional bosses in this game. They're so cool, and I was really happy to see Samus pop up, and I was blown away when that damn Chorizo enemy sprouted wings and kept on attacking me. Samus Returns doesn't feature as many new bosses, but the new bosses it does have are fantastic fights. The first new boss fight is with a machine called the Diggernaut. Samus runs into it a couple of times throughout the game, and there's even a sequence where you have to run from it or it's game over. But the boss fight itself is super fun, and I love when Samus finishes it off. She was beyond tired of this thing by the end of it. And the other new fight in Samus Returns is the Ridley fight, like I mentioned in the story section. The Ridley fight is super hard in this game, but it's also super fun and it's super cool and features some very cinematic and badass moves from Samus, Ridley, and the baby Metroid. It's quite possibly the best Ridley fight in the franchise. It's so good. And also in terms of bosses that aren't Metroids, both games have you battle Arachnus to get the Spring Ball. And now for the Metroids themselves. In the original, the Metroids were pretty much just glorified missile sponges. And they still kind of are in both of these games, but they're also more fun to fight in these games. In AM2R, the various Metroid evolutions are pretty faithful to the original game, except they've been expanded upon and made better. They're way more fun and way more deadly to fight than in the original. The Zetas and the Omegas are always terrifying to see, and they pack a hell of a punch. The Alphas and the Gammas aren't too bad, but they're still fun to fight. And I did notice that you'll run into some Alphas that are like close to evolving, and they'll actually dodge some of your attacks sometimes. It's pretty cool to see, even if that can be annoying. The Metroids in Samus Returns are also a bit more complex, just in a different way than in AM2R. In Samus Returns, they're built around the Ice Beam being able to hurt them and you having access to the counter move. Every Metroid has a move that you can counter. You definitely want to look out for that and get the timing right to wipe them out quickly. In Samus Returns, the Alpha Metroids behave pretty much like they do in the original and in AM2R. A good chunk of the Gamma Metroids annoy the hell out of me in this game because they like to run away after a certain amount of damage is done. You can typically find them close by, but chasing after them after you're getting into the flow of combat is just annoying. The Zeta Metroids are probably my favorite to fight in this game. Their moveset can be a bit of a pain sometimes, but it's nothing too bad. Eventually they'll climb onto the ceiling, and you'll be given a cue that you can use the grapple beam on them. Use the grapple beam to yank them off the ceiling, and then shoot them while they're stunned. It's so cool. And the Omega Metroids are seriously tough bastards in this game, especially the first one you fight. And the first one you encounter is actually really terrifying. You enter the room, and then all of a sudden, this big monster just comes running out from behind you. The Omega Metroids have armor plating covering their weak spots, and it takes a lot of damage before it breaks. While it's broken, the Omega will mix in its counterable attack. Try not to miss it, because not only does it do a lot of damage, it just looks so cool. Later fights with the Omegas aren't as bad because you have power bombs, and one of those will destroy its armor until it regenerates. The Metroid Queen fight in both games are pretty different. AM2R tries to replicate the original fight with a lot of the same moves and making her more aggressive as the battle goes on. The Queen will also chase you through multiple rooms before you get to kill her. In Samus Returns, the Queen's moveset is quite different, but it still makes for a fun fight. I definitely prefer the AM2R version, but both fights are great, and both fights can end with you blowing up the Queen from the inside. I do feel like AM2R's visuals for the powerbomb death are better though. Samus Returns also features a couple variants of some of the Metroids, like fiery Alpha and Gamma Metroids, or lightning-based Alpha and Gamma Metroids. They're pretty interesting and they look really cool. And both games feature the Metroid counter on the screen. Each area has a certain number of Metroids for you to eliminate before you can progress. In AM2R, as soon as you defeat the final Metroid for the area, everything shakes and the next area is open to you. In Samus Returns, when you enter an area, you find an altar that tells you how many Metroids you have to fight. And when you defeat a Metroid, you get some kind of Metroid DNA thing. Then you return it to the altar and deposit the DNA, and it opens up the next area. Both games feature save stations to save your progress. In AM2R, save stations save the game, refill all of your health, and all of your weapon ammo. In Samus Returns, it's very much like the original Metroid 2. Save stations save the game, energy stations refill your health, and ammo stations refill your ammo. Also depositing the last piece of Metroid DNA at an altar will refill all of Samus's stuff. Samus Returns also has checkpoints, typically before boss battles, so that definitely comes in handy. Both games also feature fast travel, which is great for going back to get items that you missed, and it makes it more convenient to try and go for the 100%. In AM2R, you don't find the fast travel area until close to the end of the game. Meanwhile, in Samus Returns, there are fast travel teleporters all over the place. In AM2R, you can go back and try to get everything before the final fight with the Queen Metroid. In Samus Returns, there are certain things that you can only obtain with the help of the baby Metroid. One thing I prefer in Samus Returns over AM2R, in terms of backtracking for items, Samus Returns will tell you what percentage of items you've gotten in each area, making it easier to keep track of things and where you need to go. So I've talked about how cinematic and crazy Samus Returns is with some of the moves that Samus pulls off while counterattacking the bosses, and they're all great. But AM2R is no slouch either. It has some crazy cool moments too. Like one area's core is all messed up, causing the temperature to rise, and Samus has to get out of there before it's too late. She makes it to these really slow opening doors just as the explosion goes off, and it sends her flying right through them. Or just the visual of blowing up the Metroid Queen being cooler in AM2R. Some of the coolest things in both games, in terms of the visuals, are the transformations when Samus gets the Varia suit or the Gravity suit. They look fantastic in Samus Returns for sure, but the scenes in AM2R are just on a whole different level. See? Both games are cool, but the Variasuit one in AM2R, where it goes black and white briefly like in the OG Game Boy game, that's just so good. And then my favorite ever, getting the gravity suit in AM2R, is one of the most badass things I have ever seen. In terms of the puzzles and such, AM2R does do some things different than the usual Metroids, but not in a bad way, and they're really fun to figure out. A lot of Samus Returns is just the standard Metroid procedure, but there's nothing wrong with that. I find both games to be absolutely fantastic ways to experience Metroid 2. You can't go wrong with either one of them if you want a fun Metroid adventure. It just depends on what you're in the mood for. Both games feature a few different difficulty modes. AM2R has an easy mode, a normal mode, and a hard mode. Samus Returns has a normal mode and a hard mode as well. And both games have something called Fusion Mode. In AM2R, it gives Samus her suit from Metroid Fusion, and it turns all of the enemies into X-Parasites, except for the robots and the Metroids. And it also increases the difficulty by a lot. This was not in the original release of the game, and was added later by other fans continuing to update the game. Fusion Mode in Samus Returns also gives Samus the Fusion suit, and just makes things even harder than hard mode. Current builds of AM2R also contain randomizers built into the game, which is awesome. I wish official games would start including stuff like that. It would be so cool. Samus Returns also features amiibo support. There are quite a few Metroid amiibo out there, and they all have a different effect on the game. Some other little things in the games. AM2R's charge beam will draw energy and ammo refills dropped by enemies towards you, like in the Prime series. Also like the Prime series, AM2R has a logbook, but things are scanned automatically in AM2R, unlike in Prime. And for both games, you are able to place markers on your map to indicate places for you to return to later, which I think is a great touch. And also in both games is the ability to morph into ball form instantly, which is very nice. Traveling in morph ball form in AM2R is incredibly fun because of how fast it is in that game. Also in AM2R, you're able to turn your abilities off and on just like in Super Metroid. And as usual, the games have different endings depending on how fast you beat them. Item percentage does not factor into it this time. AM2R's endings remain the same regardless of your difficulty mode. Samus Returns, however, has a few different ending screens based on difficulty. The best ending on normal, hard, and fusion mode require you to beat the game in under 4 hours. Normal mode sees Samus in her standard Zero suit, hard mode shows Samus in the Justin Bailey outfit, and fusion mode shows Samus in her outfit from Metroid Fusion. I didn't even come close to getting the best ending for this one. Both games have different styles and interpretations of Samus and the Metroids, as well as the environments, but they are both so beautifully done. AM2R features beautiful pixel art graphics, and all of the backgrounds and character and enemy sprites are gorgeous. One of my favorite looking graphical styles. Samus Returns features 3D models in a 2D plane, and I think the models of Samus and all of the enemies are fantastic. The updated Metroid designs are so insanely good. I love them. And the backgrounds are so visually stunning. I do prefer the pixel art look of AM2R. Pixel art is just my jam. But both games are beautiful. The only downside for Samus Returns is that it's stuck on the 3DS. It would look even better with a Switch port or remaster. The sound effects in both games are top-notch and quality Metroid sound effects. No complaints at all. They're all amazing. The beam sound effects in AM2R are some of my favorites. And both games feature an incredible soundtrack. There's tons of new renditions of Metroid 2's limited soundtrack as well as new music. And Samus Returns also features songs from other Metroid games. But there is nothing wrong with that. If it's good music, it's good music. You might as well use it. But yeah, both soundtracks are amazing. So that was AM2R and Samus Returns, both remakes of Metroid 2. I have played AM2R more than I've played Samus Returns, but I love them both. They're both such a good time, and their timing couldn't have been better after such a drought of Metroid content. Sure, it sucks that Nintendo shut down the fan game just as it came out, but hey, they own the Metroid IP, so what can you do? They at least waited until it was already out on the internet. Anyway, both games are an amazing time and worth a playthrough. You really can't go wrong with either one. If you want some amazing Metroid action, check them both out. And when we jump back into the Metroid franchise, it's finally time for Metroid Dread. And I am so excited. Thank you all so much for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And if you want to see more of me, you can catch me streaming all kinds of stuff over on my Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/CaseyTheGamer91. And I also have a Patreon where you can get perks like early video access and some other cool stuff. And that one is patreon.com/CaseyTheGamer91. You can find those links and all of my other links in the description below. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope to catch you next time. Peace out.